Hi, I'm Anderson Brown. I'm going to talk to you today about empiricism and the law of fact. Let's get that screen up there. Okay. And hopefully, what I'm really hoping today, I'm going to give you a sort of an explanation, I think, of what empiricism really is. Hopefully, somebody out there might see this and sort of get that flash and understand a little better what this divide is between empiricism and rationalism. And I think this really, when you get a lot of talk about continental versus analytic and all that stuff, I think it's really getting at some really basic things, very useful to understand. And I think you might see also that this is the aspect of empiricism that a lot of people like myself find to be, to some extent, obviously quite persuasive. So I'm going to do it by example, but let's get on. And I'm sure at this point, the question that most people would be asking is, what is the law of effect? So let's talk about the law of effect. Positives reinforce and negatives extinguish. It's really as simple as that. You recognize it from behaviorist psychology and conditioning. Again, the first bullet point, positive outcomes reinforce or replicate and negative outcomes extinguish. It's really just as simple as that. And you have to ask yourself about the legitimacy of that claim. I think, as I say here, I think somewhere it's self-evident, a ubiquitous truth in nature, as I say in that second bullet point. But again, we're doing philosophy, so that means you have to ask yourself, is it evident to you that positives reinforce and negatives extinguish? One thing I always do, and I'm talking about this, looking at the third bullet point on the slide here, think about ads, jokes, melodies, memes, ads that move product or repeated. Advertising executives can tell you all about the law of effect. Jokes that get a laugh are repeated. You tell a joke, it's funny. You tell it again. If it's not funny, you don't tell it again. You really don't tell it again if nobody thinks it's funny. And melodies, think of a melody that stays in your head. Think about larger ideas, philosophical ideas, scientific ideas, political ideas, religious ideas. These too come under this law of effect. And sometimes we're aware of what it is about them that causes the positive reaction, and sometimes we're not. So last bullet point, the law of effect, which again, I think is self-evident. I'm not exactly sure how to put that, provides an explanation for the emergence of complex structures. That's really the technical part of it in both the natural world and in human culture. And so I'm going to show you in this video how that is the bedrock of empiricism. It really is what empiricism is all about. So we'll start with David Hume, sort of the grandfather, if you will, of empiricism, writing in the middle of the 18th century. And the dictum that sort of defines empiricism for Hume is that all knowledge is produced by experience. He defines, what is that? He defines beliefs as expectations about future experience produced by habituation to the regularities of past experiences. Again, it is the conditioning model, and operationalist or behaviorist psychological models just come straight out of David Hume. He's got that full blown in his philosophy. A little more technically, in the second bullet point, Hume thinks that people learn by inductive inference. He thinks inductive inference is the primary part of inference. Rationalism tends to think that there's something built in the first place that's driving the inferences, a kind of deductive inference. Inductive inference, a set of similar experiences, produces a generalization. This has a lot to do with, let me even just step out of this for a second to talk about that. We talk about empirical science. Natural science or physical science is also sometimes described as empirical science. What does that mean? Well, typically the model of observation is that you make a number of observations, your data set. You've got a big set of observations. The bigger, the better, of course, because observation is open-ended. So the more observations you've made, the higher the probability that your generalization is correct. So you make lots and lots of observations, and eventually you form a generalization because the observations are consistent in that way. And notice also that science isn't different from ordinary common sense learning in that way. All science is ordinary common sense learning taken up a notch in terms of being careful, keeping good records, controlling for variables, and that sort of thing. And when we understand that what science is, that it's an empiricist methodology, it also sort of takes a lot of the mystery out of that, I think, as well. All right. Then again, as I say there on that second bullet point, Sherlock Holmes, for example, is always make the deductive inference because he's really smart and he knows all these generalizations. So he can look at an individual clue and use all the generalizations that he already has to interpret the clue and identify what sort of set it belongs to. Last bullet point, again, important philosophical point. This is a non-cognitive learning theory. The genius of David Hume, he says at the beginning of the treatise, he needs to have a psychology that works for babies and dogs. I think he's right about that, and he does that. It's not a logical procedure, and Hume doesn't see human beings as particularly logical beings. Descartes, thought you were certain about something if you could prove the logical necessity of the thing, and Hume points out you can't prove the logical necessity of just about anything. So again, Hume just doesn't think that kind of rationalist logical approach to certainty, to epistemology in general, is the right kind of approach. All of empiricism is non-cognitive in the sense that I'm going to go over, I think, 4 more empiricist thinkers really quickly here. And I think you will see that they all are inside this Humean model of talking about the law of effect as producing knowledge. Okay. So, and here you go, the bottom observations. At the bottom of the slide, you see the set of all observations. Then on the left, you get the inductive inference, making generalizations to the theories. On the top are the generalizations, right? And then you can, once you have a lot of generalizations like Sherlock Holmes does, then you can form hypotheses about particular observations, that is, identify their set, and that's deductive inference. Really, really basic stuff to understand, and that logical point is really the point, I think, that in many ways separates empiricism from rationalism. Okay, so let's talk about his compatriot and friend, Adam Smith, David Hume's friend, also a Scotsman in Edinburgh in the middle of the 18th century, who famously published The Wealth of Nations, an economic tract, in the year 1776. Smith applies the law of effect to economics. It's pretty basic. That is, you have two reasonably rational, reasonably self-interested and autonomous individuals. They enter into some kind of exchange. If one or both of them is dissatisfied with the outcome of that and doesn't think they got a good deal, they won't do it again. But if both parties to the exchange are satisfied and think it was worth the price for what they got from the other one, they'll do it again. And this is just fundamentally the principle that Smith uses to show in The Wealth of Nations how a complex economy organizes itself this way from the bottom up, from these, if you will, atomic interactions on the bottom. That is absolutely an empiricist approach. Using this axiom, he generates a range of economic principles. Of course, the most well-known one and the one most obvious is supply and demand, and the price going up if the supply goes down, and the price going down if the supply goes up. On Smith's model, the law of effect is the invisible hand. So the invisible hand, as if there's an organizer, as if there's a designer, but there isn't one, notice. There is just the application of the law of effect across a very wide range of human economic activity, of human trading activity. And that then does give rise to a complex economy. By the way, Marx, now we say Smith is sort of the apostle of capitalism and Marx is his opponent, but it's important in terms of intellectual history and understanding these ideas to understand that Karl Marx is very influenced by Adam Smith. Wouldn't have written the things that he did if he hadn't been familiar with Adam Smith. Marx living, of course, in London. At the same time that Marx is living in London, there's a good segue. Charles Darwin lives at his estate outside of the city. In Cambridge in 1829, Darwin wrote, "My study consists of Adam Smith and Locke. And I mentioned that Darwin is inspired by reading Adam Smith, because again, it shows you the ubiquitous nature of the law of effect. What Darwin gets from Smith, who's writing about economics, is this application of the law of effect and how it can be used to explain the emergence of complex structures. Darwin, of course, looking for the mechanism of speciation. By around the turn of the century, from the 1700s to the 1800s, the scientific community understood that speciation was happening. Remember also that the English in the 19th century are some of the best breeders in history. Many species of animals are many breeds of different kinds of animals. Think of farm animals, for example, come out of England in the 19th century. Not the only ones, of course, human beings have always done this, but everywhere. But the English in the 19th century particularly good at that. So this idea that traits are passed down was, just truism to them. It was hardly as if that's a theory. And it's unfortunate people talk about the theory of evolution. There's no theory at all. Darwin simply says, well, I think that the way speciation is happening is through this application of the law of effect, which I explained there in the second bullet point. And again, think of memes, your jokes on your morning social media. A set of replicators will have an average number of replicants. Okay, if 3 jokes are told, then they are repeated. So, take the number of times the jokes are repeated and divide by 3, and you get the average probability of reproductive success of the joke. Some parents in reproducing species have an above average probability of reproductive success. That's what's called fitness. Remember, Darwin didn't know about genes. That comes later on with Gregor Mendel in the end of the 19th century, and then full blown in the beginning of the 20th century. When Darwin talks about fitness, he's talking about the traits that some parents in a reproducing species will have traits that then are more conducive to reproductive success in their own lives. So again, just to reiterate that in the last bullet point, the law of effect's not a theory that might be proven false. What is the law of effect? It's sort of a little proof in mathematical logic. I think that's probably what the law of effect really is. Sometimes people will say, oh, well, that's all been called into question. Unfortunately, Stephen Jay Gould, who I think would be horrified if he understood that he had done this, pointed out that we have what's called the synthesis, the Darwinian synthesis in the 20th century, because we appreciate that there are things like genetic mutation and genetic drift that also contribute to evolution. But look, the law of effect is still the bedrock of evolutionary biology. It still is the thing that is completely ubiquitous in the emergence of traits and speciation. Nor is its application limited to biology. It's universal premise in the natural sciences. You can't turn away from evolution and biology without saying that you really don't accept pretty much the bulk of natural science in toto. So Charles Darwin, again, someone applying the law of effect. John Stuart Mill, who's, we mostly know about Mill's, popularly Mill's ethical work is the most well-known, and we tend to concentrate on the definitions of happiness and issues like that in ethical theory. But I'll point out here to you that Mill's utilitarianism, his ethics of maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering, is very much an application to the law of effect. Mill's best known as the first bullet point, advocating causing pleasure or suffering is the ultimate standard of rightness or wrongness of intentional acts. We call that consequentialism. It's the consequence of the act in terms of promoting happiness, minimizing suffering, that makes it a good or a bad act. Second bullet point, though, the law of effect is fundamental to these consequentialist theories. Again, how do you know that the action is a good or a bad one? You look at the results of the action. And this is a case-by-case thing, and that's very important to Mill as it was to Bentham before him. Ethical conventions can only be established in the first place through the trial and error process of experience. Yeah, that's what I was saying. That's implicit in the whole thing. We don't always emphasize that because we're looking at other aspects of the theory. The goodness or the badness of the experience is contingent on human nature, so we just have to basically experiment. Of course, Mill, liberal-minded person talking about rules, we can after a while realize that some things generally are conducive to happiness. Last bullet point, again, the very important, maybe one of the, one or two most important points of this video. Mill, like Hume before him, is a non-cognitivist about ethics. Kant is a cognitivist about ethics. Kant says you universalize, you ask whether or not the thing you propose to do could be acceptable to any rational being, and that's a logical exercise. Kant, I think, mostly a rationalist. Hume, though, like Mill, though, I'm sorry, like Hume, a empiricist all the way, a non-cognitivist. Hume said there was this moral sentiment that humans were endowed with by nature. He didn't know why they had a moral sentiment. Again, it was a non-logical thing that humans had. Hume, very smart. He said, look, I don't know why this is, but perhaps some scientist, a natural scientist, will show how it is that human beings have been endowed with a moral sentiment. And about 100 years later, sure enough, it was Charles Darwin, right, who said, because of group selection and group fitness, talked about the evolution of altruism and empathy. So Mill, like Hume, again, notice is a non-cognitivist. What does that mean exactly in the case of Mill? That what happens is that we're constantly looking to see whether or not our actions and policies are conducive to happiness and not conducive to causing suffering, harm principle. And that is, again, an application of the law of effect. William James, pragmatism, very much a part of empiricism. Again, I think pragmatism isn't a sort of one-off. Pragmatism is the general line, the general trunk of empiricist thinking. First bullet point, William James applies the law of effect to epistemology. William James is giving us a theory of truth, which is an area of epistemology. That what is it that such that we come to think of a given proposition as true or false. And James rejected the pre-reflective Cartesian correspondence theory, your common sense theory of truth, right, that most people are going to have walking in the door, is a kind of correspondence theory of truth. Because obviously, well, my belief is true if the world is like that, and I want my belief to sort of match on to the world. But notice, and the adjective I use there is Cartesian. That's sort of very deep inside this paradigm that what learning is sort of forming a mental representation that's an accurate representation of reality, which is involved in all kinds of complications, really. I think it's a lot stranger of a thesis than people might think. James recognizes that individual kinds of beings in individual kinds of environments or particular kinds of environments are going to have different kinds of epistemic needs. Kant mentioned that also. Notice I mentioned Kant along here because Kant is an excellent philosopher who's really on a lot of these things. So I'm always sensitive to do him justice. Recognizing that different beings in different contexts would have their own sets of epistemic needs, James argued that it's the utilities, that is the causal and predictive power that one gains from accepting or using a particular proposition. And that's what causes that proposition to become a belief, to become something that you would say, I endorse this proposition. It's an instrumentalist epistemology, driven again by selection over variation, the law of effect, trying out different things. Some things work. You may not always notice that the reason that you're thinking what you are is because it's working for you, but that's really the right explanation. And again, the philosophical third point, just as the law of effect obviates the need for a designer to explain speciation, right? Darwin can show that the law of effect will give you the evolution of complex organisms. Adam Smith will show you that the law of effect will give you the evolution of complex economic systems. And so it eliminates the need for a representational theory of mind. And that is metaphysically very important. Again, anti-Cartesian in general, anti-rationalist. Kant also very much committed, if anything, even more than Descartes, to a representational theory of mind. Already evident in Hume. Hume uses the term impressions, which is a vague term. And I think that's something that Hume, of course, also very much understands. Finally, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And just like William James, if we want to understand Ludwig Wittgenstein, the most important systematic thing to see is that he is in this empiricist tradition. He applies the law of effect to develop an empiricist account of meaning in the same way that James does to develop an empiricist account of truth. Meaning, traditionally, a kind of almost magical kind of occult property, a property, say, that the proposition is supposed to have. Remember, it's supposed to be a problem that it's the semantic content of the proposition that's producing the behavior on a sort of propositional attitude model of intentional psychology. Functional role semantics is the phrase, a mouthful of a phrase, yes, but again, just, and very much like James, notice the semantics, that is the meaning, what we're calling the meaning of the proposition, is the use of the proposition. We use language to do different things, and it's the thing that we're doing in the world with the language is what we're calling the meaning. And this, I think, as I say there, it really fits much more naturally and intuitively with our understanding that language is constantly flowing and evolving and changing and shifting. You can't control it. You really can't social engineer it very well. And that's because language is use, meaning is use, legitimacy in language is use. So again, the philosophical part and the last bullet point there, then that eliminates those traditional semantic properties of the meaning, the truth value, and logical relations between propositions. And in fact, the transcendental propositions that have to exist to have these non-physical properties. The metaphysical problem with meaning is that it looks like it's a non-physical property. Physical objects don't mean things. Ludwig Wittgenstein gives us, again, this essentially philosophical behaviorist account that what we're calling the meaning is really sort of the aggregate of uses of the symbol, many of them very similar, but of course it's always slowly shifting and changing. So again, very much an application of this law of effect. Just to talk about metaphysics a bit, and empiricists didn't want to do metaphysics. Hume thought he was sort of ending metaphysics altogether. Wittgenstein also very hostile to sort of speculative metaphysics. But it's important to see nowadays, especially at the beginning of the 21st century, the late 20th and early 21st century characterized by a great renaissance of metaphysics in English language philosophy, a lot of that because of the philosophy of mind. Nominalism. Now, what is nominalism? It's a kind of materialism. The nominalist says the only thing that exists are sets of physical objects. And so terms bottom-up alternative to Platonic rationalist top-down metaphysics of transcendental forms, right? So the second bullet point, sorry. Abstract nouns in property terms. Abstract nouns like beauty or justice, property terms like redness or circularity are names of sets. So nominalism, the noun, right? That's where the word comes from. It's a metaphysical position. A very interesting philosopher named David Lewis holds this position. Many other 20th century philosophers working with nominalism. Wittgenstein, again, a nominalist, saying that you have the set of uses of the proposition. That's really what you're meaning, those uses, by the so-called meaning of the term. So just to sum up, the last bullet point on the slide, Hume's beliefs are conditioning sets of experiences. I've been conditioned by the set of all of my experiences. Smith's economic laws are determined by these sets of exchanges. Darwin's natural selection is selection over these replicating sets. Mill's ethics is these determining sets of consequences. They're the things that are driving the ethics. For James, truth is the set of the most utile propositions. And that's really the thing that's giving any given proposition legitimacy. And Wittgenstein's meaning is the set of uses, the set of all of the uses of the proposition or the symbol or the word or whatever it is. So all of these empiricists are nominalists. And let me then just step out then, because that's the end of the presentation. And as I said at the beginning, hopefully that might be helpful if you're sort of wondering what empiricism sort of really is, and what it is that unites different empiricist philosophers, and what it is that sets them apart from the rationalist tradition. I really do think it's at bedrock this application of the law of effect. And I think having a good understanding of the law of effect, a little fluency in seeing the law of effect at work. For example, what would be an example? People say, oh, well, maybe humans have transcended evolution now. But again, the law of effect is not the kind of thing that you can turn off. Evolution it's just still just the quotidian thing it always was. Somewhere out there, there are some humans that are having a lot more babies than the other humans, and that's the direction. So again, for example, so again, I hope that that has been helpful. Just trying to get a little quick run through of the role of the law of effect in empiricism and how that helps to define empiricism and sort of bring it into focus. And I hope I've managed to help somebody do that today. That's certainly my goal here. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will talk to you again some other time.